Hi, dog mums. Welcome back to the Natural Dog Mum podcast. We're joined today with Integrative Vet Dr. Karen Goldrick. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so lovely to meet you.
Thank you very much for having me, Sherry.
It's an absolute pleasure. Toxins in the home environment. Rather large issue, something that a lot of dog mums don't know so much about. There's more and more education out there about considering what goes into your dog's bowl. But toxins in the home, where do we even start?
Yes, that is a very big question. And I think one thing to remember too is that our dogs and our cats are more exposed and more susceptible to chronic toxin exposure because of their location on the floor. So they're in amongst it. And because of their very small body size, which means that they will have relatively higher levels of toxin in their system than we will. And so that's two reasons why it's really important that we think about their environment. Dogs and cats walk on the floor, they lick their paws, cats groom themselves, which is a very common cause of toxicity. So it's a very important thing to consider is their home environment. And I guess there's a range of things in the environment that may accumulate and be toxic to dog and cats. So things that people might think about are cleaning, their cleaning chemicals, and certainly things like chlorine and bleach are known to be, really irritating and can burn and cause respiratory irritation. And, over time may disrupt the immune system. So it's really important to think about cleaning agents, renovating, really important one, exposure to things like lead paint and asbestos can really be toxic. Pesticides, so thinking about things that are used outside in the garden, things that are used on the lawn, particularly weed killer. And people probably have heard about glyphosate. Glyphosate's been linked to lymphoma in people. It is actually the most common herbicide used in Australia. There certainly are studies linking herbicides to different cancers in dogs. There's a specific study that links Scotty Terriers to an increased risk of bladder cancer with exposure to herbicides, not specifically glyphosates, interestingly. And also there's an increased risk for dogs for lymphoma. So really important to consider not only in your own backyard, but also exposure in parks, on other people's nature strips. And I guess as an aside, one important preventative strategy that we often talk about is every day wiping feet, wiping the undercarriage, maybe with cats with a damp flannel, just giving them a wipe over, just to reduce the potential for them to lick it off their feet. And this also actually reduces a lot of foot irritation, foot dermatitis that we see in dogs as a result of exposure to grass residues. So herbicides are a very important consideration. I guess insecticides. We use a lot of insecticides, obviously. We live in an environment where we have to share our homes with cockroaches, ants, fleas, which can cause health issues for dogs and cats. We really have to consider our use of insecticides. Probably a more recent environmental toxin that we have started to talk about is the impact of synthetic fragrances. So whether that's like airwick diffusers, reed diffusers, even essential oils, especially if they're poor quality, if they're not pure oils. And a side note on oils too is we have to remember dogs and cats, their sense of smell is, I can't remember the exact number, but it's many, many times more sensitive than ours. So something that we think is quite pleasant, a little bit of lavender on an oil water diffuser. We don't recommend oil burners, but water diffusers, we find that pleasant and relaxing, could be overwhelming for a dog or a cat. So even, scents that we think are calming and therapeutic, there are ways of checking the safety and different strategies for using them. But we're more worried, I think, about the potential risk for, those really smelly underarm sprays, even a lot of perfumes, a lot of perfumed like moisturizers, and the impact of those. There's some evidence that they may cause what we call endocrine disruption, so leading to things like thyroid imbalances, which are potentially, illnesses we see both in dogs and cats as they get older, as well as oxidative stress. And the other thing we see in dogs and cats is respiratory irritation and coughing and asthma. So, and cigarette smoke, of course, and vape smoke. In fact, cigarette smoke, passive cigarette smoke, it has been directly linked to nasal cancer in dogs, oral squamous cell carcinoma, and other oral cancers in cats. So, absolutely something we want to avoid, any cigarette or vaping anywhere near our pets. Probably another one that maybe people are not acutely aware of is what we call mycotoxins, which are toxins that grow on molds. And so these molds may occur in crops, but they can also occur in the house. And a particular risk in our pets' environment is actually in their food, particularly dry food that is stored inappropriately. A common problem is people will open a big bag of dry food and tip it into a tin, and then they'll put another bag in there when the other one's not quite finished. And so the food at the bottom is actually accumulating over a long period of time. And mycotoxins are potentially carcinogenic, may be associated with long-term liver issues, other long-term degenerative diseases. And so strategies to reduce exposure to mycotoxins might mean thinking about diet, but also importantly, just thinking about storage, thinking about making sure the food's in date, making sure it's airtight, probably not buying a large bulk bag of food to save money, because you might actually end up, doing yourself or doing your pet a huge disservice. Fire retardants, I guess these are chemicals that are often used maybe in nonstick cookware, in soft furnishings, in fabrics. And these are also, I think, potentially associated with what we call endocrine disruptors, but also in the human field have been linked to some types of cancer. So I don't know that they've made that link in the veterinary world at this point, but we often look to what's going on. There's a lot more research going on in the human side of things. There's a lot more money to be spent. So we're often taking our messages from what we're hearing there. Plastics, that's another big one. Plastics in food bowls. We do actually see dogs particularly getting facial irritation, dermatitis from plastic food and water bowls. Plastic toys as well can cause inflammation, irritation around the lips. But there's also risks with things like BPA and microplastics that they might be ingesting. So whether they're, you can replace with good quality stainless steel or glass, depending on how dangerous that might be. And thinking about the toys that you're buying for your pets and whether you can replace them with other things, maybe, food treats, uh, maybe, you can source toys that are made of natural rubber, hemp, rope, obviously making sure they're safe and they're not going to be ingesting small foreign bodies.
I wanted to talk about chemical load or toxin load. That's one of the poorly understood things out there. People will think if they use something or they're exposed to something and they don't react relatively straight away, that's it, it's fine. They don't understand how toxins accumulate in the dog's body and what that can do over time.
So a lot of what we are talking about is the chronic cumulative load of these chemicals. We're not talking about acute toxicity. And a lot of the health issues we see are as a result of a chronic load. And I guess they cause a range of different health issues, from chronic inflammation, oxidative damage to different organs or systems, particularly the gut or the liver, endocrine disorders. So we've touched on thyroid issues, both hyperactive thyroid that we see in cats and underactive thyroid that we see in dogs, may be driven by chronic exposure to chemicals and toxins. Immune dysregulation, which can potentially lead to immune mediated disorders, so really serious problems like immune mediated thrombocytopenia, which is an immune destruction of platelets. So that's probably one of the more serious ones that we might see. But any of the skin immune mediated disorders, polyarthritis, those sorts of things could be, driven by chronic exposure to chemicals. Dysbiosis is a common one that's probably not readily recognized. You may notice something quite simple, like a little tiny bit of mucus in the stool, and it might be intermittent, so you might ignore it, but that actually might be a sign that we're getting a gut, an imbalance in the trillions of organisms that reside in our gut due to chronic ingestion of mycotoxins, heavy metals, other chemicals. And this can then lead to not only gut issues, but allergies, immune issues, etc. Many of these toxins are potentially carcinogens, although it hasn't been proven, it's certainly been suggested. And we also see things like unexplained elevations in liver enzymes that we can't find an underlying cause for. So that would be, or maybe things like allergies that we really can't explain or manage properly. Chronic recurring gut issues that we can't seem to find a specific infection or food allergy. So they're the sorts of things that we may see. And there are now, I guess, some tests that we are starting to be able to do, but this is really baby stages, I think. It's probably future medicine. It's probably not going to really be a sort of power player or a power hitter in my time, but we are looking at doing things like dysbiosis index to actually identify imbalances in the gut biome and see if we can try to address them more specifically through diet. We're looking at hair mineral and toxicity testing as a way of identifying chronic exposure to minerals and metals. It's an emerging area that we can then sort of use that in conjunction with, say, liver blood tests and then maybe detoxing strategies to see if we can get improvements in something like a liver blood test or in just the hair mineral test itself. So that's a long kind of work in progress, but that's another thing we can do. You can do blood and urine tests for a lot of these things, but they're more useful for acute toxicities and not so useful for long-term accumulations. Glyphosates too, I guess we can potentially test glyphosates levels in urine. Certainly it can be done more readily overseas. I think it's a little tricky to do for dogs here in Australia. So some things we can't really specifically test for. It's more probably about identifying a health issue, doing a sort of a detox strategy, which might include liver support, gut support, kidney support, and maybe looking at some other detox remedies, but with careful use of things like zeolite, chlorella, and spirulina, which sometimes in themselves can be problematic. So shouldn't just be using them without some guidance. So I guess, yeah, chronic toxicity is hidden, but can certainly lead to a range of chronic health issues. And we may see improvements if we take steps to identify and address these toxicities.
I think not wanting to scare any dog parents out there, but I think it's important to know because a lot of owners, as I mentioned earlier, symptomatically, if nothing happens within a short period of time, they seem to think that they've dodged a bullet. But the other thing is to understand that the accumulation of all of these chemicals, as soon as their organs are overwhelmed, they're not going to be operating efficiently. And that build up, even before you see symptoms, that build up is happening. So it's just really important, I think, if nothing else, to keep that in mind and just be aware of things that you're using on your dog, feeding your dog, things in your dog's environment. And, talking to an integrative vet, talking to a naturopath herbalist about things that you can do, to support your dog's body to help them process these things properly.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So there are steps you can take. Certainly, we've covered some of them in brief in your own environment, removing things, by wiping your dog. And it's good to try and do those right from the get-go. There's a lot of toxins in the environment that we can't reduce. They're just there, unfortunately. So things that, looking at specific support for the organs of detox is always good. We do talk to puppy owners at the very beginning of their relationship about the sorts of things they can do in their environment to reduce the toxic load, the chemical load for their pet. We are dealing with creatures that have a bigger surface area and a smaller body mass, which does increase their risk because they can absorb more, but their body can take less. And so they are much more likely to get toxicity from a level of toxin load that potentially may not impact us too much.
I wanted to ask about the nervous system connection, about how environmental overload can affect behaviour and emotional wellness.
Well, probably the angle I would approach that would be looking at something we call the gut brain axis. And that actually comes back to what we call dysbiosis, which is about an imbalance in the biome, the plethora of microbes that reside in our gut, and the direct link, I guess, between the brain and the gut. And so anything that disrupts the gut biome, anything that causes dysbiosis or leaky gut syndrome, can impact behavior via that sort of gut brain axis. So that's one reason why when we're addressing dogs with stress or anxiety, one of our focuses is addressing gut health. So I guess, coming back to chronic accumulation of toxins, most toxins or many toxins are ingested. And so they can have a direct impact on the gut health, but they can also be indirect impacts by just the impacts they're having on other systems, particularly liver, kidney, and how that might impact the health of the gut indirectly and therefore lead to things like stress and anxiety. Some toxins may also be directly neurotoxic. I guess common ones we think of are are more acute toxins, like high levels of lead in puppies can cause seizures. We understand that isoxazolanes, which is the insecticide used in some of the modern tick products, is also potentially a neurotoxin, and some dogs have had seizures after acute dosing with those. So some toxins are certainly direct neurotoxins, but potentially the more significant impact is chronic low-grade exposure. I guess one thing we haven't into in pets, and this is something that's looked into more in the human field, is, for example, mobile phone use and the impact on brain health and the potential risk for brain cancer. Now, our pets are not using phones the same way we are necessarily, but maybe there are some risks if they're with us while we're on the phone over long periods of time. I don't think we can make that association directly, but certainly we know that environmental toxins, many of them, neurotoxicity is one of their effects. And apart from things like heavy metals and insecticides that I've already listed. So I guess, yes, the brain behavior can be impacted both directly and indirectly by chronic exposure to many different toxins.
Absolutely. And have you found that some dogs are more genetically sensitive to their environment, or some breeds? I mean, obviously smaller breeds, I would flat faced breeds, those sorts of dogs.
It may depend on what we're talking about. There's some associations. We talked about cigarette smoked and long nose breeds are actually more exposed to, say, nasal cancer from exposure to inhaled toxins. Dogs with small airways like pugs and French bulldogs and also cats are probably more susceptible to asthma, airway irritation, coughing, respiratory disorders from fragrances, from toxic things like the fumes from non-stick fry pans, toxic fumes from cleaning products, essential oils, those sorts of things that are more likely, and cigarette smoke, of course, likely to cause airway irritation, which can lead to very serious respiratory problems in those breeds. So whether there's a genetic the only thing I guess comes to mind is the MDR1 mutation, which is present in some breeds of dogs like collies and related breeds, which means that they're not capable of metabolizing certain chemicals. It's associated with ivermectin toxicity, other drug toxicities. So that's probably not necessarily environmental toxins as such. So I don't know that we have specific breeds that are, say, genetically predisposed to getting particular toxicities, but it might be more about their anatomy, their shape, their size, and how things might impact them. Copper in diet, it can cause liver problems, and we're starting to see that as a problem in Labrador retrievers and other breeds as they get older. And we're not quite sure what the issue is and whether it's the specific ingredients that are used or copper that's added or large amounts of liver. So some of these things we're still exploring. And the reason why some breeds are represented more than others in these areas is not probably really fully understood at this point. So a lot of these things are things we're learning over time rather than, things we know straight away. And I guess it's all about coming back to just trying to reduce the chemical load from what we know. There are things we can't reduce. Food is a big source of problems, whether it's mycotoxins, heavy metals, glyphosates, all kinds of toxins in food, even food that we think is sourced beautifully. It may depend where it's grown, it might depend on the storage, it might depend on the ingredients, but there's a lot of toxicities that we get over time through food. And that's, I guess, a big part of what we think about. But in terms of environmental toxins, yeah, I don't know, apart from thinking about the size and the shape, that there are specific genetic predispositions to different toxicities.
So you mentioned earlier suggestions like wiping feet and wiping belly after being outdoors or going for a walk. Are there any other tips for dog mums or dog parents to reduce exposure in their home environment?
You could consider like HEPA filters to reduce airborne toxins. I guess that's one area that we could look into. Thinking about, we've talked about, I guess, thinking about the cleaning products that you use. If you're renovating, that's a big problem because you've got all kinds of things happening, potentially new carpets, new soft furnishings. You may need to potentially remove the pet for a few weeks until some of that has dissipated. So yeah, we talked about wiping to reduce the glyphosate. We're talking obviously not smoking, wiping also reduces some heavy metal. I guess the soil ingestion can be a problem. Some dogs do chew on soil. That's a tough one because we don't always know why they're doing that, but trying to reduce their access to soil because you never quite know what's in the soil, particularly in the
Yeah.
backyards of older houses. Plastics, I think we touched on before, thinking about the toys you have, what they're made of, what your dog's doing with them, whether they're chewing them, if they're chewing them, are they at risk of microplastics? Trying to source toys that are made from natural materials. Natural rubber might be a better option to synthetic rubber for some balls and things. You can look at you can get things like goat horns or cow hooves that you can fill with food to as an alternative to Kongs, for example, and sourcing toys made from natural substances, but also making sure that they're not going to swallow a bit of hemp rope. Like that's just as disastrous, really. Mycotoxins. I think we did talk about food storage, food sourcing, making sure that you're that you're cleaning the food storage container each time, not just dumping the new bag on top of the old one. That's a very common cause of mycotoxin toxicity. Apparently about 25% of pet foods may contain mycotoxins, and certainly it's a common reason for pet foods to be recalled. We do, I guess, as holistic vets, supplement with things like milk thistle, reishi mushroom, cordyceps mushroom, probiotics, but I think it's something that's got to be done appropriately. I don't think you just do it for every dog, for every situation, for long periods of time. Definitely addressing gut issues. I think it's really important to make sure the gut is healthy. So taking steps to support all the organs of detox. But since gut issues are such a big problem, doing what you need to do to get the gut right. It might just be as simple as a diet change, but there might be a little bit more work involved. And as I said before, we do sometimes look at, doing testing the dysbiosis index to look for imbalances as well as checking for infections. We do sometimes look at doing hair mineral testing to see if we can find any evidence of chronic accumulation of toxicity. So I guess they're the sorts of things that we just look at doing, just reducing the chemical load around the house, thinking about the cleaners, thinking about the shampoos, thinking about airborne fragrances, fumes, toxins, things you're using in the yard, but also things that they may be being exposed to outside of your home environment in the local parks. That's probably about it.
Certainly a lot for people to unpack. Thank you so much for spending the time. It's been lovely chatting with you, and I would love to do it again.
Thank you so much, Sherry.